So welcome, everyone. I'm Lisa Giordano, and I'm one of the coordinators of the Unconscious Bias Unveiling Racism series of panel discussions, along with Camilla Ross and Catherine Green. We're all members of the Southeastern Connecticut Women's Network, as well as the Emerson Theater Collaborative. And we have been doing these panel discussions for months, actually. We started last September. This is the 6th in our series. We've covered topics such as systemic racism, women in voting, anti-Semitism, race and diversity within the Latinx culture, women in science. Next month, we're going to be talking about equity in the corporate world. And tonight, equity in education. Before we get started, if you could please turn off your video if it's on and stay muted. We're just going to have the panelists and moderators keep their videos on so we can focus on them. And if you have a question, please put it in the chat so at the end of the panel discussion, we can access them. So tonight, Elijah Manning is our moderator, and I'm going to introduce him, and then he will introduce the rest of the panelists. All right. So Elijah is an activist dedicated to bringing a more inclusive teaching into the school curricula. He has started his own company, Inclusive Education, LLC, to help further this work by doing anti-racism and racism awareness workshops in schools. He has been involved in conversations with Norwalk's Board of Ed, been on panel discussions with the city, helped to facilitate conversations with Artreach in Norwich, Connecticut, as well as implicit bias for Clinton Library and PTO. Having grown up on the shoreline of Connecticut and Old Saybrook, he's honored to work with cities and towns in southeastern Connecticut. So Elijah, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Lisa, I appreciate that. I am honored to be here with these wonderful women and their important roles within our state and their own communities as well. It is my honor and my privilege to help them just bring information to all of us. I am here not just to talk, but I am also here to learn from all of them and grow and expand. So I want to say thank you to them. And first, it's a big thank you to Dr. Carrie McWilliams. She is a senior associate at the Great Schools Partnership, a 501c3 nonprofit school support organization working to redesign public education and improve learning for all students. Thank you, Doctor.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm happy to be here to be a part of this panel discussion today.
Happy to have you. All right, and next we have Miss Shepard.
Good evening, everyone.
She is a Dean of College and Career Services at Achievement First Amistad High School in New Haven, Connecticut. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here with you all.
And then we have Miss Shepard.
Hi, everyone. Good to see everybody.
She is Organizational Director, Hearing Youth Voices, New London, Connecticut. So thank you to these wonderful women for the work that they do, again, in their communities. And I am excited to talk and learn from all of them. So we are all here because education is important to all of us, obviously. That is, I think, pretty well stated in what we all do. So without further ado, we're gonna just start getting into our conversation. So there are so many different topics that we can choose from when it comes to equity in our schools. I would like to start with schools and school resource officers. I'm gonna jump right in there unless somebody else wants to talk about something else. I think we should start there because I've had this conversation with other people. So right off the bat, there's been a debate over school resource officers or SROs, if you've heard that. In New London, I've heard they voted to do away with resource officers, but in New Haven, they voted to keep them with a new approach to their presence. So I believe having New London and New Haven represented.
Yeah.
How has that been for each of you? So for New London, let's hear what went into the decision and how it's working out so far.
Yeah. So basically, coming out of what like we in the organizing community are referring to like a summer of uprisings, right, around like police brutality and like the sort of catchphrases of defunding the police. It really wasn't a new idea or demand for our organization. Like we've been looking at the over-policing of Black and Brown youth since like the inception of our organization 7 years ago and many before us, right? And so it really came out of thinking about one, like over-policing of Black and Brown youth, that just being like the most prevalent part of this, but then thinking about like how our communities are spending money, right? And so looking at the funding, looking at our underfunded schools here in New London and looking at a salary of $100,000 going to a school resource officer, which is like a position designed for safety, right? Which it's such an interesting word to be discussing in reference to police, right? Because there's been so much conversation with young people about like, well, whose safety are we actually talking about? And are school resource officers there to keep students safe, or are they actually there to police students? And so it's been our experience, and all of our research has showed that they're doing more policing of our students than they are doing protecting and keeping people safe. So it just like the timing of everything really lined up perfectly for us to say, hey, like let's look at this budget and let's think about one, like why are we funding this money to this position that we don't really need, and what could this money be going into? So the process here in New London was we had a very aligned and supportive Board of Education that said, hey, this MOU hasn't been signed in over 4 years, so the police officer position shouldn't even be here. And so let's start looking at what support we actually need to be building if this position shouldn't be active, and also like, yeah, we could be funding what students are actually calling for, which is more mental health support, right? So that's kind of how it's landed here in New London. And the process we're in is thinking about like how as community do we build policing alternatives? Like what are police responding to? And it's been testimony of police officers in our community, right? Like we get called for things that we don't really need to be showing up for. If a student is in a mental health crisis, why are we calling a police officer? What is that going to do? It's just going to exacerbate the situation. That's what all testimonies have shared, right? And so the moment that we're in now is like, okay, we actually have everything we need in community, right? Like we have our community healers. We have the input from young people who are the people living this, right? And so let's build the thing. Like, let's actually fund the things that people want and the things that people need, and not continue, let's not continue to fund the idea and the action of policing our students.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mr.
Yeah, and I've worked in New London, in an administrative capacity, and I can say, having worked with SROs, you would have to look at them as when they were used as a resource. People don't understand that there are contracts. They're still police officers. So that policing part and that mentality sometimes comes into the school, and it's not really the place for it. And this is when I was there, it was before Sandy Hook, before that, travesty. But at the same time, for those viewers who may be from out of state that don't realize, New London is 6 square miles. The police can get to any school in New London in less than 5 minutes.
30 seconds. 30 seconds. Is
30 seconds. Well, see there, Maya, is definitely less than 5 minutes. 30 seconds. 30 seconds. And so I agree that there's not a reason for the police to be there all day for our students, because so many things happen that are beyond their control, that sometimes students need to come to school, well, all the times they need to come to school, and that needs to be a safe place for them mentally. And
Mhm.
what people don't realize is that just seeing the uniform, how much trauma that causes students.
Absolutely.
And they're in full, there are SROs in New London who are in full uniform with weapons on hip, with the police car parked out front. And that just sends such a message for students. Now I've had SROs that were wonderful, that had a great relationship with students as a person.
Right.
But when you have on that uniform, you're representing that institution.
Absolutely.
And you having 1 or 2 degrees removed from somebody having a negative impact or having seen something, they don't need to bring that image into school with them. And as an administrator, I was oftentimes told, well, why don't you just call the SRO? Because this isn't an SRO thing. I mean, this is school. We're teaching students. This is not
Right.
practice. And you know, if I had a dime for each time someone was telling me to call them and wanting the kids to get ticketed and arrested, I mean, that's not something that you needed to have.
Mhm.
And it was more of, I'm telling you from the inside, it was more of the policing of students, or
Mhm.
something happened in the community 2 days before, 3 days before. Where are all the kids gonna come? They're all gonna come to school. And I just could not allow, or would not allow students to be subjected to things like that. And for that reason, I became unpopular, but that's okay. I'd rather take the brunt of it than subject students to something like that, so.
Absolutely. Ms. Shepherd, before we get to you, New Haven, I wanted to just read something that was, I read in the CT Examiner, and it's about the difference between New Haven and New London. So in New London, like I said, they voted to do away with resource officers. In New Haven, they have voted to keep them with a new approach to their presence. This comes in the way of change of clothing and no longer parking the police cars on the school grounds. And in the article I read, State Senator Gary Winfield of New Haven was quoted saying, "They are police. They are not people who should be giving discipline, nor should they have ever been." So that goes to what Dr. McWilliams was saying a moment ago. And coming from the New Haven schools, how has this approach been working for all of you?
Well, currently I'm at a school where we do not have resource officers. And when I first joined the New Haven school community, because I was in the Bridgeport school community before I came to New Haven school community. In the Bridgeport school community, I was at schools with resource officers. Okay. And just in similar experiences that both Dr. Williams and Miss Shepherd, that's my sister, spoke on, and overly policing Black and brown bodies and creating a very contentious dynamic, especially just being present in the hallways. And so when I speak about currently in New Haven, I'm sorry, I get distracted by the chat, so that's what I was doing. So, yeah.
That's all right. Keep my eye on that so you don't have to.
I'm like, the teacher in me is like, okay. But currently in this admin seat at my school, we don't have resource officers, but we do have a role that probably exists in a couple other schools called behavioral specialists, or what we call culture teams, culture climate specialists, which are typically people of color, men of color in particular, who are the ones on call to de-escalate, students if a teacher deems a student worthy of removal or worthy of like a conversation, or just ultimately deems their behavior as like unruly or disruptive to the learning environment. At our school, we have what we call behavioral specialists. And so where they're not in a uniform, they do play a role of policing. And we revisit this conversation. I actually just got out of a think tank with students as we think about how do we improve, like as we go back to school in person next year, we were soliciting feedback from students, like what's something that you don't want to see? And they're like, we actually need to change the way we talk about culture of schools, because we always link it directly to behavior of Black and brown students. We talk about school spirit and school and school culture. And part of that starts with like reforming the idea of like who is protecting the culture or the climate of the culture in a school, which usually falls on like the behavior specialist or the resource officers, right? And so I think it's a heated conversation out here because my school does not have resource officers. The school down the street does, and some would argue that that's not fair. But just because we don't have police in our buildings doesn't mean we don't have people in our buildings who are put in a position to police our children. It's the same, ideology.
Right.
And so every year since I've been in education, since I've been in this seat, in this admin role, we're always revisiting this conversation of who is like responsible for controlling or like setting the temperature for culture, and why do we constantly have to link culture of a school to behaviors of Black and brown students.
Right.
So I'm going to get to the questions in there real quick. I just wanted to put up a quick graph that is, I find it very disturbing, disheartening as well. This is a lot of where the US, obviously it's not entirely up to date, but this is when 2013-14 school year. And as you can see, it's the all US schools and who gets arrested, who gets in law enforcement. And there's the color coding underneath. So you can see where the who gets arrested, 33% are white, 33.4% are Black, and then it goes into Hispanic and Asian. And then it says who gets referred to, and then it's who does overall enrollment look like. And you see the discrepancies in the data where the highest overall enrollment rate is the white numbers, but yet they match almost evenly with who gets arrested. And there's not a huge discrepancy within who gets referred to law enforcement. And then there's a breakdown that you can even go ahead and see by state. I won't go through all of that. There's a lot of information for everybody to look at. But I would say that this type of information is important for everybody to take a look at, because when you have statistics, you are less prone to argue and more to have a discussion about changing the system. And I think that's part of where we are as a society. We need to have the discussions to change the system and not just argue about who's right over what the statistics may show. So I wanted to point that out and encourage everybody to please go on and look at this type of information. I will stop sharing that now so that everybody doesn't get overwhelmed by all the things I'm putting up constantly. So real quick, one of the questions from Ms. Stephanie Hill, and this will go to anybody who wants to jump in or everybody. Were these votes by the school boards or school boards only, or did parents and students have input? And that is an interesting question.
In New London, was it just the school board? I'm thinking it probably was the school board since it was a
yeah, so for us, it was a school board vote, but leading up to that, what we had was an influx, like a really large amount of input, like from our organization, like community members through our organization. And so us funneling that feedback from students, from parents, really just like not understanding why they were there to begin with. Right. And like who made that decision to begin with. Yeah, so that's how it worked here. And then also what supported this decision was another demand of ours. So we started our campaign Fed Up New London in June, right? And this was a demand of the campaign for New London Public Schools to end the contract with New London Police Department. And the second, one of the other demands was for there to be a committee convened that gets to look at policing in a community convened committee, right? A community, committee of community members convened. And so the mayor convened this committee and all of their recommendations came out really aligned with our demands around the shifts that need to happen in policing. So it was a vote, but also supported by a lot of community input.
Yeah, in New Haven, there's literally a New Haven Public Schools, like school school security committee that actually put forth the vote. But similar to what Maya talked about, in the city, there were like several conversations or think tanks where people can come out and share their perspectives. And so there's this way where you are kind of soliciting input from like students and families and members of community, but the final decision makers at the table are not necessarily students and families. It is the board and committee.
So a lot of this information that we talk about when it comes to SROs, for me, there's always the idea of the school to prison pipeline. And I think sometimes people don't understand where that comes from and what that means. And I think by us simply having the conversation about the SROs, a lot of that information can be portrayed via the school to prison pipeline, because it's a lot of situations where those same students are the ones who are repeatedly called on and then taken in by those SROs and taken in to actually being arrested and things of that nature. So this kind of transitions into adultification of students. So I know, Dr. McWilliams, this was an important issue you would like to really bring up.
Yeah, I could talk days on this one.
Yeah.
The adultification of our young people, especially our minority females, precedes even having like SROs in the building. It's just a matter of how they are portrayed, how they are, the adjectives that are given to just describe them. They're considered rude and loud and boisterous, and just the things that would get a child placed out of a classroom, and basically not just outside of a classroom. If we start calling things what they are, when children's educations are being denied.
Absolutely.
But that's what's happening. When they're not in the classroom learning, their education is being denied. When you are calling and embarrassing them about the way that they're dressed, they're more likely to be harassed on the way they're dressed, not only from adults, but also from fellow students. And then when they complain, oftentimes it's not taken seriously. And so when they lash out, then they're the ones who end up being sent to the office, or their parents called, or they're in trouble, until the point where they don't even want to come back. I mean, I can tell you, because a young lady, a Black kid or a young Hispanic child comes to school in a pair of shorts and a shirt, they're both from Aeropostale or wherever, and then you have a white kid in the same shirt and shorts. Well, you want to talk about the way one child's body type looks in these shorts versus the other. Well, it's the same pair of shorts. They have to buy what's sold in the stores.
Absolutely.
So why all of a sudden, well, it's too seductive, it's distracting. No, it's not distracting or seductive. It's only that when you make it that. The child's body is what her body is.
Yeah.
And that's one way that we always look at our children, and somehow we start to make them be adults rather than the children that they are. I don't care how aggravating it may get to be for people in education. The frontal lobe of their brain will not be developed until they're well into their 20s. So you trying to make it develop because other parts of their bodies look differently is a problem. And also culture-wise, in Black and Brown communities, the way we communicate is different. We are going to speak up, and we're going to speak out, because that's what we've been taught to do. Does not mean that we're being disrespectful. It's just our culture in a way. And back to what you were saying, Maya, about I'm sorry, not Maya, two sisters here, Maya, about the culture and climate. No one wants to talk about the culture and climate that's being oppressed, because what you want from our children is you want assimilation.
Yes.
And they're not willing to give the assimilation. Because I was down in New London this June marching with several of my previous students, And they're like, Dr. McWilliams, you here? I was like, I am. Because, and one said, you were trying to tell us this all along. Yes, I was. So, not only are these children taxed with trying to take care of their families at home, they're taxed with code switching, trying to live in two universities at school. They're trying to navigate all of these different challenges. And then you want to make them become adults. And then when they come back at you like an adult, then you get upset and you want to kick them out.
And you want to push them out.
You want to push them out because our students don't drop out of school. They get pushed out of school because they know they're not wanted, they're not loved, they're not cared for. And when I say care, it can't be the care that turns off at 3 o'clock. It has to be the care that you really, and they know when you care for. I would have kids in New London and in other districts where I've worked, they would leave, they would purposely get kicked out of class just to come and talk to me. And I said, well, okay, we got to find a better way. So it's things like that that we just have to stand up. And I would come in and I would actually work with some of my parents because parents know what they know. And many of them, some of them were young, and they just get frustrated because then they reflect back on their school experience where they were adultified. So, so it was a lot of lashing out and not the communication. And it's not that people don't care about their kids. And I try to tell people this all the time. They're like, these parents don't care. Yeah, they don't care about what parent has a kid and says, you know what? I'm just not going to care about you. No one. They care about their children, but because it looks different than the Anglo-Saxon way of doing things, you then dismiss it as anger or uninvolvement or not caring.
Or neglect.
Or neglect or don't even get me started on the DCF referrals, neglect or the type of discipline that you wouldn't do for your child. And that's not it. We need to have more understanding of different cultures, and not only the understanding, just the book knowledge and theory. We need to get the understanding so that we can apply it and we can respect it. They always want to throw respect up on school walls, but you want that respect to go one way. And you want that respect to go to the way of assimilation, to the European ideals of doing things. And when your community doesn't reflect that, you're not going to have it. You're going to constantly have this conflict.
Before either of the sisters get into it, there's another question. I'm going to address that one in just a moment about culture climate experts, but I have one that is going to continue that one. But I do want to share another graph, because again, I think representation for these is extremely important. So this is rates of suspensions for girls in K through 12 in the 2013-2014 school year by race. And obviously you can see the Black girls versus the white girls, but what I really want to point out to you is the difference in the bar graphs, the colors, all right? This small one down here for the Black girls is the percent of enrolled, all right? And then it's in-school suspensions, single suspensions, and then multiple suspensions, all right? And then we're gonna come over to the white girl side, and it's the percentage of enrollment, which is almost as high as the percentage of multiple suspensions for the Black girls. And then it drops for number of school suspensions, in-school suspensions, and then number of single suspensions, and then number of multiple suspensions. And then we see in this other graph, this is the percentage of all girls enrolled and that were referred to law enforcement. Again, you'll notice there's a descending one as well, and one drastically different especially when you see the enrollment side of things. So I wanted to point those out to give context. And as we're getting back into the conversation as well, the culture climate experts is part of the question, is where were the culture climate experts? But I take that further, and I even ask that, are there courses offered for administrators, faculty, to bring about the awareness of these biases?
Yeah.
I think we're all kind of thinking the same thing. I just want to say a thing about, I really appreciate the question, and I just want to ground us in the fact that, like, wherever, like, we are the culture climate specialists, like we are them. And in fact, like young people are their own culture climate specialists. And so
Yeah.
I want to ground us in that for a moment and say that like we just have to start listening to each other. We actually really have to start listening to young people, right? It's the whole thing behind like believe young people when they speak to you. And what adulting, what marginalizing allows us to do is like remove the humanity from people. And so we don't have to listen. Like
Right.
you're just a number or a struggle. And so I'm not listening to you because what do you have that says I have to listen to you? It's everything Carrie was saying about respect. And it's just so interesting, like all the things we really have to kind of flip on its head, right? Like even the fact that respect means different things to different people.
And looks
like,
different across
it looks
culture.
different, right? Like culture is about commitment, right? It's less about words and like what the words say, and it's about like how are you committing to being like human with someone. And so I'm sorry, I'll wrap this up in a second, but the last thing I want to say is like this idea around when we think about people, right? And we think about, like rowdy behavior, right? I think like we just have such an obsession with punishment in all of our institutions. Like we're just so obsessed with it, right? Like you have to be punished if you're not in compliance. And that limits us. It limits us so much to what we could create, right? Like what could really look like, we created a platform called Schools That Work for Us. And it really breaks down in 7 themes, like what a school climate, or like just what an environment that is responding and meeting the needs of young people looks like. And you better bet that the foundations are relationship. You better bet that foundations are safety, right? It's mental health, it's resources, it's understanding the struggle people are in every day. So we want to talk about trainings, right? Like listen to people, listen. Like commit being human. Yeah, go ahead, Eddie. I'm done.
Listening is
first and foremost. And it's also, this speaks to something that I've really been on my spirit after attending my cousin's dissertation, but it's also about witnessing, like humanizing and witnessing, especially around the Black girlhood experience in our schools. And so much of the experience is about silencing and punishing, that you cannot witness somebody as human if you're so focused on trying to have them fit into like a model citizen framework. And so, but so much of our schools don't focus on that. And so when you think about, I've been a part of many trainings. There's so many trainings that are going on. I think we can all attest to, especially in the remote space and, coming from the summer that we came from, there's so many schools that are like, let's get some anti-racist training for our staff and courageous conversation frameworks, which are great. And I think when you think about the virtual space, like it's very inauthentic. So when you show back up in the building, as an admin right now, I'm thinking about some of my teachers who've only ever taught remote, and then they have to go back into a building for the first time and be in front of Black and brown children and witness them and hold space for them as human and build relationships. Another challenge that we experience in schools is how people build relationships with Black and brown children, and offering, it's like a low bar when they build those relationships. It's like rooted in like too much information or getting too much in their business. Believing that that's how you build relationships with Black and brown children. Like they gotta, you're kind of like, that's how we adultify them, because you're building relationships and engaging in conversations with them that they're actually really not ready or shouldn't be talking to a school member about. And we often have to teach a lot of our first year teachers, second year teachers, fifth year teachers about what are healthy relationships and conversations to have with students. Especially our Black and brown children, because they're gonna tell it all. They're gonna be like, such and such said this, told me this.
Yeah.
They're gonna tell it all. And Carrie, you had made a comment, you know, when so many kids, like sometimes they act up in class because they wanted to go and to be removed the class to go to you. And when I first got into education, one of my mentors said, is like, if you ever want to know the person in the schoolhouse that is holding space for Black and brown children, like, where are they going when they're cutting class? Because ultimately that is the person who is holding space and witnessing them as human. And that does not happen in a lot of our classrooms.
They definitely, people definitely do not want our children to take up space. And they need to take up space. It is inherently in our culture to take up space. We dance, we move, we talk, we oratorical. Much of our history is not written, so it's oral history. So telling me to be quiet all the time and giving me assignments that require me just to write and never to speak is a problem. And it's not because it makes my peers uncomfortable, it's because it makes the adults uncomfortable. They feel threatened when too many kids are up and moving around. And sometimes you just ask people like, are you sure you want to be in education? Because, you know, these are kids, they move. They're not robots. And they have voices and they need to be heard.
Absolutely. There's a quick comment coming in, and I thought it was important to address this one. It says, so if a school doesn't have an SRO, then culture climate experts take care of someone beating up someone else?
Yeah, I appreciate that comment a lot. And I think it's good. Like, this is the part that we may lean on avoidance around, is violence, right? Violence and conflict. And it's really important that we talk about it. Because I think, like, I think fights are inevitable. I just want to name, like, fights and therefore, like, the umbrella of conflict is inevitable. Wherever there is, like, one or more humans, like, there's going to be conflict. And so, like, really getting to the root of, like, how we decide to be in conflict with each other. Like, if there was more learning of that, like, we could figure out, like, where does violence come from, right? Like, it's always a symptom of something. It's not the end. And so, like, really wanting, like, I appreciate this comment so much because I've been in so much thought about it. Like, really wanting to not see, like, violence or conflict as an end, but as the door, right? Like, how do we get here? How do we get here? And we deal with that experience, like, in a humanizing way, right? Like, that's what restorative and transformative practices are all about, right? Which I know, like, a lot of schools in Connecticut, like, are supposed to be, like, there's some mandates that we're supposed to be practicing them. And I say supposed to be because it just doesn't happen. And there's so many reasons for that. One, the most prevalent, I think, like, it's a practice that is so much outside of the way our institutions are set up, right? You're asking institutions to actually work against the way that they're set up by by centering humanity, by bringing people together to discuss the why. And so just to respond, I think, I think that there are so many other people that could respond in the occurrence of a fight, right? But mostly what really needs to happen is, like, those two humans, like, being able to sit down and actually face each other.
Absolutely. I also want to just name, like, when we think in this binary idea that it's this person's job to do this thing in a school space, that's when people check out of being in community. Like, that's when people check out of building relationships and actually creating space for restorative moments to happen, because we train teachers to think that's somebody else's job. And in some ways, when you think about, like, the flow of systems in space, it's all of our jobs, especially if we want to create, I don't really like safe spaces, but brave spaces for students to have a positive learning experience. And so I'm always in tension, even as an admin. They're like, oh, that's your job as the admin. And I'm like, well, actually, let me train you up, because when we begin to think it's this person's job, then it's not your problem. So then these don't become your kids. So then you're actually not part of the school community.
Yes, and I wanted to just add to what you're saying about, you know, how it opens the door to find out where the conflict came from. It gives us a moment to actually have conversation with one another. And sometimes it's in a way that an SRO may not allow for a conversation to be had. And I think that is really important because the SRO's job may be to end the conflict once and for all. But if you don't sit and discuss and have the two opposing parties sit in a room where they have to face each other in a different capacity, where they have to be able to communicate with one another, I think that changes the dynamics as well. So I just wanted to add that in. And I have a comment over here that talks about all these similar issues in higher education. There are always conversations of increasing campus security and programs that advocate for students to call security if they need a ride home, etc. But not all of her students of color feel safe using these programs. It's a constant fight to have administration understand the problems with just focusing on increasing security. And I thought that was an important moment to bring up. And then there's another question. Does anyone have experience using conflict resolution with restorative practices?
Yep, that's one of the things that we offer at Great Schools Partnership. We work with several districts in restorative justice. And with that piece comes a lot of training and a lot of talking. And people, again, having that brave space for students to say their truth and people to actually hear it and internalize it. Because remember, when we think of school violence, automatically people think of two students fighting each other. But sometimes the conflict is not against student, it's student staff, and it's not a physical violence, it's the violence of words and how you speak to students and how you treat them and how they feel when they actually go into a physical space. So that restorative justice, I've had countless teachers march a child to my office and say, well, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna put them out of school? Because they want, you know, he said a curse word, you know, he used profanity. He should be gone home for 3 days. Why? Like, that doesn't teach a kid. My comeback oftentimes would be, you know, if I send this child home on a suspension, that gives them 3 days to sit there and marinate on exactly why they don't like you. So this is not teaching them anything. And that's not how the real world works anyway. You're not going to get sent home from your job. When you get sent home from your job, you not have a job. So if we're in the teaching and learning cycle that we're supposed to be in, we're supposed to redirect students, let them know this is a way that you can handle, what's another way you can handle this situation, and have them come up, they can come up with their own, and they'll tell you why they didn't do it. You know, some of my most profound incitement has just been come after two kids have a disagreement and having both of them in the office and just having them talk about the situation. And you know what? Usually by the end of the day, they're sitting there going, you know what? We were just putting on a show for other people. This was the expectation of everybody.
Yes.
and it doesn't have to, and I say, you know, and it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to live your life like that. All your job is to come to school and get an education. And sometimes it's harder to get the adults to understand that than it is to get the children, because children, they'll learn and they'll listen and they'll bounce back. But some of the adults, they're a little long in the tooth, so they stuck in their ways.
So I just wanted to kind of circle back. The graph I showed is from a Georgetown Law review that they did on a study of the adultification. And I just wanted to put a pin in that by saying the results that they found are as beginning as early as 5 years of age, Black girls were more likely to be viewed as behaving and seeming older than their stated age, more knowledgeable about adult topics, including sex, and more likely to take on adult roles and responsibilities than what would have been expected for their age. So I just wanted to finish that off so we had some context about that. There's a question in here that is about SEL, social emotional learning, during the pandemic, and how schools are spending more time in advisory classes. What are schools getting right? What are they getting wrong? How can we make SEL more culturally responsive? Anybody want to start on that one?
Yeah, so I think I think just like anything in the remote space, I think the idea of doing advisory and centering social emotional learning is important. And it actually shouldn't exist. It should exist in concert with everything. But what schools are getting wrong is they're having it live in silo. Like, this is the space for social emotional learning, for activities. This is the space where we listen. This is the space where we grapple and talk about themes. And then when they go on to the next class or whatever, the conversation stops. And so again, connecting back to like, it's all of our jobs to do this work. These are all of our kids. Social emotional learning is culturally responsive when it is in conversation with every class or every space that a student is in, even in the virtual space. And we are, so we're doing advisory. We are hybrid. And I think that it's actually more impactful now that we're in schools and students can actually express themselves and tell us that I actually want to talk about this in history class. Cause like the way we do advisors, we talk about different subjects. And I think it just, it's like the conversation can't just live in silo. And so I think that that's the push. And that's the push with a lot of these things that we're talking about. Everything is in conversation, in concert, not in silo. Not this thing that only happens in the AM thing or the PM thing in the day.
Yeah, I agree with that. I tend to think a lot of the programs that I've witnessed are, you know, SEL is white supremacy with a hug. And I'm not, you know, if people are allowed to be their authentic selves, we won't have to worry about the social emotional part. I know how to be emotional and social. You're born that way. That's innate. It's the communication piece. If there was just a shooting in my community, for me to come to school and for you to give me a test like it just didn't happen, or I just didn't see it on TV, is to show to me that you don't care about what's happening in my community. And when I say my community, I mean, it could be happening in California, it could be happening in St. Louis, it can be happening wherever. If you know that these things are happening and you can read your students and you care about your students, then that day, that assignment isn't taking place. The assignment then is to allow people to talk and breathe and speak. And to what Italia was saying, you can't just say, okay, hold on to how you're feeling right now and all that anxiety until we get to advisory right before lunch, and then we're going to talk about it. It's almost like you're asking somebody to separate their physical self from their soul, and nowhere else do we have that. I guarantee you, if you'll take the day that there was the Sandy Hook massacre and George Floyd, and look at classrooms on those days, they look totally different. Take 9/11 and not Fidel Castro, I'm sorry, to anybody, Sandra Bland.
Philando Castile.
Thank you, Philando Castile, thank you.
You're welcome.
And look at those classrooms the next day. It's gonna be totally different. And I'm not telling you what I surmise, I'm telling you what I've lived, because I have been the one that says, oh, we're pumping the brakes on this. Do you not know that this is what's happening in the nation right now? This has just happened. So we gotta process this with our children, because they need to process it. People just want to go on like it's a regular day. Okay, we're gonna do phonics, you know, we got a test, we're gonna dissect a frog, you know, as if nothing happened, which means you just canceled my whole being out. You don't even see me. Like I shouldn't hurt. Like I wasn't scared walking to school this morning. And those are the things that people really have to understand, that sometimes the curriculum is right there in front of you and it's not written in a 3-ring binder on your C drive at school. Your curriculum is to get students to deal with this and do something with the anger. How do you respond, and how do you do it collectively? How do you do it? And let that, you should be able to plan your lesson around that. But there are so many people who are stuck in lock and step in doing things and not speaking up and taking that brave space in that time to do things.
We have an important comment coming in. It says, I work within a program that's focus is SEL and non-cognitive skills. This deeply resonates with me because we hold that safe space for our students. We teach them how to send better body language signals and self-advocate with quote unquote difficult teachers. Some teachers appreciate what I do and see me as a stakeholder, and some resent me and deny me access to my students. It's real. Yeah, and that is very, very disappointing and upsetting to hear that there is a denial when a student is in need of that kind of attention. And this is going to parlay for me into the next question, which brings up more minority representation as teachers and staff members. And, there's a Connecticut Mirror article that said, during Wednesday's State Board of Education meeting, officials said Connecticut should be able to reach its goal of a 10% minority teaching staff by 2021. In October 2015, minority teachers accounted for 8.3% of the total teaching roster. That percentage rose to 9.6% by October 2019. That's what the officials said. And then there has been research that has been done. I don't think I have that pulled up. I should try to find that. But there has been proven that teachers, minority teachers, teachers of color, are not just beneficial for their own students, the students that look like them, but it's beneficial for all students. And I mean, the studies say it helps testing increase, it helps grades increase. Now, in each of your communities, there's always the question of these other more predominantly white communities, rather, that have a harder time bringing in teachers of color. What can those communities do to help reach out to these types of teachers to be able to bring them into their community?
So, all right. So here's the thing. I'm from Mississippi originally. So I had teachers of color. I had principals of color. I didn't really understand that there weren't people of color in schools. That's how rich my upbringing was. My children, I have 2 girls, they never had a teacher of color. They didn't even have a lunch lady of color, okay? So when I say that to say this, you have to make your community one that is welcoming of people of color, first of all.
Exactly.
And that's the job that white folk have to do with each other. We don't have anything to do with that. Because I can tell you to go to one of the 28 or 30 HBCUs on the East Coast, they're putting out teachers every day. But I would not want one to come to some of these communities and think that there was going to be a space for them to raise their own children and to be comfortable. That's what you have to work on your own community. What are you doing with other people, other white people, to make the community palatable for people of color? Why do you think we are people are family oriented? We like to cluster with people that look like us, that listen to us, that and so that's what's going to happen. So you're going to have the clusters of places like a New Haven. You're going to have them in Hartford. You're going to have them in Bridgeport. You're not getting people to come to Stonington to teach because, one, it's not welcoming, and that's unfortunate, and it needs to be. But that's not the onus is not for people of color to do the work. The onus is for the white people within their community to make their community somewhere someone wants to be first, before you can ask somebody to come and start having careers. And that's not only for teachers, that's for doctors, that's for lawyers, that's for everyone. Because I can tell you, working in a school where you're the only person of color and have to justify each and every one of your moves, what you're doing, your motive, why you're doing it, why you look like that, where you been, who you coming with. No one wants that. No, and because there are other districts that will welcome them, and there are people retiring, and they are the ones who are getting the top talent of people of color. So if you want the segregation to end, you got to undo what you did to segregate yourself in the first place.
Absolutely. Before I go to the sisters, there is a study that relates this to the same type of information when you talk about policing and why, you know, sometimes there needs to be additional police that live within the communities that they police. This is no different than teaching, because when they're looked at as outsiders, then they're not actually part of the community. And if you can't bring them into your community, then how is the community supposed to feel when they see these quote unquote others? And that is directly influenced how, you know, some of these Black and brown communities see policing that don't live in their neighborhoods. And then it's the same with these, you know, white people who don't see the Black and brown people in their communities. So there's a through line with both of those that there's a reckoning that needs to happen with this. And I think we're finally at least starting to acknowledge this in ways that we haven't yet prior to. So, the sisters, do you have anything you'd like to add to this?
Yes, I think I've always like wrestled with the conversation around like diversifying the teaching pool, because it's performative in a lot of ways. And so that's why, to Carrie's point, you know, like we grew up in Waterford, Connecticut, and I'm not teaching in Waterford, Connecticut. I'm in New Haven, right? And so I think about, specifically when I came into this role, it was because students walked out. Students shut down the school and like walked out of school and said, we need more people who look like us. Then we got more staff of color, and it's like, so now what? Because representation is not liberation in a lot of ways, because you want people of color to come in and be complicit in structures that are spirit murdering Black and brown children. Exactly. And so as yes, I went to Howard. Like there are Black people and brown people going into education, because they will say you on the narrative that like people, they don't want to teach. And a lot of our experiences of being in schools are not always affirming ones. And so that impacts how we decide how we want to show up in education spaces because of our own trauma. The own trauma that we have experienced as Black and brown people going through the educational system, which is one of the most racist systems in the world, right? Yeah. And so it needs a lot of reform. And so when I think about spaces what can school districts do better, you actually have to just disrupt. So when a person of color comes into the space and hold space, hear them. That's on the white teachers, the white administrators to understand the value. But also don't make it a burden. Like sometimes it's just like the burden is so heavy. When you're a Black educator in a space where everybody does not look like you, but everybody's teaching kids that look like you. Right. Right. And so you have to become the liberator of the space, but your peers are not helpful in that. And it's all on you to do that work. And so we don't stay in those spaces. We want to be in collaborative spaces. We want to be in spaces where it's not about courageous conversations. We're about to have a conversation, right? And so we want to be in those spaces. And so schools have a lot of work to do, and they have to be open and committed, because schools will do a lot of trainings and PDs that will last a couple of months and then taper off. So it is about the commitment work and the consistent work.
I mean, what can I add? I get the wrestle and the struggle with this one is real, because I've worked in 3 school systems in Connecticut, and I've watched Black educators really just burn out time after time after time after time. And so yeah, for me, it's about, well, what is exactly what Attila said around like, what is the commitment? Like, what is the commitment towards shifting environment? Because that's actually what It's like you gotta tear out what exists. And who's gonna do that? Who's gonna do that?
Right.
You know, like who is ready to actually, what existing institutions are willing to lead the charge and say, yeah, this institution is inherently racist. Right? Like that's how we exist. And so I really struggle around the representation being and it is a demand of our organization as well, right? Like, but I really struggle with this representation piece because what are we actually setting educators up for? And so I think, yeah, it really comes down to like, it comes down to commitment, and it comes down to as.
Oh.
Yep.
But it does, to pick up what she's saying, it does come down to that commitment, and it comes down to people actually willing to do the hard work. They have to do this hard work with a T, what's inside your chest first, the hard work, before they can do the hard work.
Yes.
And people want to do a lot of busyness and not change their core. And that's the problem. And I do understand that we have people from the university scene on here. So I do want to, if you don't mind, Elijah, I want to touch on that just a minute, because we have been talking K-12. Let me tell you something. Pre-service teachers only learn what's being taught to them. So the representation in our higher ed is just this, it looks just like K-12. You may have one or two Black people, brown people who are trying their best to push and disrupt the white supremacy and decolonize syllabi and curricula to put things on the table for teachers to learn and better teach Black and brown people. But when your university chairs and boards do not change what they think is the priority and won't open up a department and won't give leadership roles, and they're just going through the motions and checking the boxes, we're just turning out more and more pre-service teachers that do not get the things that the two sisters and myself are talking about right now. That's because we're people of color. It's not because we learn any of this in higher ed. Mm-hmm. Well, the HBCU will probably learn a little bit more, but the rest of us not. But I mean that is what I'm telling. Like this is not textbook. This is bringing up, you know, Eva and Amster's child. This is what's happened in my life. So when we say that we need to disrupt the entire system, we need to disrupt and dismantle the entire system.
Absolutely. We're going to move to another question, but I just want to say there's a wonderful study that is by the, oh, sorry, I X'd it out. There it is. The Century Foundation. It's from 2016, but it is about how racially diverse schools and classrooms can benefit all students. And it talks about a lot of how having, you know, I was mentioning about not just the representation, but how it helps all students. But it also, what they studied was that when there was some more representation for teachers, it propelled students of you know, Black and brown communities to pursue more teaching on their own. So it helped in that way. And as the sisters were talking about, you know, that it may not always be beneficial in certain specific ways when you don't have the integration into it, but and when you have the standards to set out, but the more it perpetuates, the more the new teachers will be able to uphold those standards, because they're going to be perpetuating more and more students of the Black and brown community. So just wanted to point that out. And so as we go to representation for, you know, students, we also need to talk about the inequality for English as a second language learners. And we know there's been federal legislation passed to ensure that students all receive an equal chance to learn. It goes back to the Civil Rights Act, but it was further defined in 1970, then in 1974 with the Educational Opportunities Act. And with the case of Lau v. Nichols, that was heard in the Supreme Court, and it stated, There is no equality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum. For students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from all meaningful education. And reading from the English Learners in Connecticut Public Schools, they say, the decision also stated that there must be a policy in place to educate limited English proficient students. The policy plan is referred to as that LAU plan. So Connecticut has the administrator's guide that I mentioned a moment ago, but can any of you speak on exactly what Connecticut is doing to help provide better access to these students that have English as a second language?
I think the silence says it all.
I know. I was like, I spoke last.
I mean, this to me is because we always say like Black and brown students, and I'll speak from the I as we think about, like, let's turn the lens on ourselves as we think about the school communities that we often support. It's always a second thought. It's like, oh, did we translate the newsletter? Find somebody to translate the newsletter. Did we put the blast out? I don't know. It's just so heavy because the fact that we're asking this question, and I would say like, we don't know because we're not, I speak from the I feel like we are at schools are just, I mean, we're still talking about I'm sorry.
It's a complicated question, and I only bring it up because literally it shines light on the inefficiencies that we know we're having within the schools. So because there is such a issue that we all have in understanding where they're going means that there's no real set plan for where they should be going. And I think that in itself brings awareness to the greater problem that we all have swept under the rug, I guess, and that now we are going to have to start having a reckoning with. And I mean, that's just one of the problems. We've listed several others, but I think that right here in and of itself is an important distinction that we all have just made in knowing that we all have work to do when it comes to that. And that, you know, none of us can maybe necessarily lead that conversation, but it doesn't mean we can't certainly follow along when these guidelines are presented to us so that we can grow further and be able to come to some kind of understanding that the work needs to be done in different ways.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yes.
Maya, you have something right off?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that what this brings up in me is really the clear need to really center ourselves around like solidarity, right? Like between like Black and brown solidarity. Like it's like we're always saying it. We're saying Black and brown bodies and Black and brown students, like, you know, and I think I'm speaking to myself in this moment too. And what does it actually look like for us to be in solidarity with each other, right? Like the understanding, some of like the lens that we work from is like, you know, Black liberation is liberation for all people. And so like, what does that actually mean when we're talking about English as a second language learners, right? Like, does it mean when we think about curriculum, like I think just in general, institutions have a lot to learn from like political and popular education spaces, right? Where like the input is given from everyone that needs to be considered, right? And like it's second nature to like translate a survey. It's second nature to translate and not just one language, right? Like in multiple languages, right? Like there are Black immigrants too, right? Like we like just like there's so much conversation there. And it really starts with solidarity. Like it starts with us being able to like see each other and not be in this really strange and like counterproductive fight around like who is more oppressed, right? And like just seeing us as a people that really need to be working together.
Right.
Yeah.
And the system started wrong, right? Because when there were white people coming to these shores, the first language that was taken away were a language from our indigenous people. So we have to, if we're gonna dial back, we gotta dial all the way back. That was robbery, okay? So we purposely made them assimilate. So now we fast forward to 2021, we wanna have conversations about multi-language learners and say, hey, we need to have everything in French Creole and in Spanish, but see, you can't erase my brothers and sisters that were indigenous. How about we go back in and give them the culture you snatched from them? So it's deeper than that. This is more, we want to talk about language because it, again, checks that box in this system that needs to be dismantled. Again, when you talk about people who are coming from Nigeria, Nigeria has 3 huge tribes. They don't necessarily get along with each other. But you'll have a teacher in New London or Waterbury or whoever, Waterford, they'll come and they go, oh, they're all from Nigeria. And they'll put them together and wonder why they don't get along. Well, because this kid is from the Igbo tribe and this kid is from the opposite Warren tribe, and you got them here together like they're supposed to be friends. And what you don't know is that's not culturally responsive because you didn't take enough time to sit down, get somebody in the community. If you needed a translator or call, there are services that will do it over the phone with you, and have a conversation with the parents and get to know about your students first. So you got to do that back work because then you got the union coming in and saying, oh, they can't do this outside hours. You got to pay them $50 an hour. Who has time for that? We're dealing with people. So again, we got to go all the way back and dismantle and replenish some of the languages that have been lost first, and not first, but also respect the languages we have sitting in front of us today.
Absolutely. So I appreciate that. We all know we all have work to do on that aspect, and the solidarity aspect of it is incredibly important. That we all need to find ways to work together. We see what's happening with our, the AAPI community on top of it. And, we know the past history with, specifically the Rodney King era of time. But now we're at a precipice where it's important for all of us to work together to try to come up with this plan of action moving forward. And we had talked about curriculum and curricula in general. And as we know, there is a Black History Month. There's also a Women's History Month, and then there's a Black Women's History Month. So the fact that there's that alone states that we are not teaching a full enough curricula to the students. So what we're not doing is teaching all facets of our multi-layered history. And there's a quote by a poet, singer, or songwriter, author, workshop facilitator, and educator, Reggie Gibson. And he spoke on America's tenuous relationship with the past. And he said, I think our problem as Americans is that we actually hate history, so we can't really connect the dots. What we love is nostalgia. We love to remember things exactly the way they did not happen. History itself is often an indictment, and people, we hate to be indicted. So what that did is it left us a choice. Do we save face, or do we teach all the blemishes that history has all over it? And we are now at a point where we should be pushing that curriculum to teach the decolonized, sanitized version of our curricula. And I myself, that is one of the things I have been talking to Board of Educations about. But I'd love to hear ideas on how we can continue to push and get this to be a more open teaching, because I always use this example. When we teach about Christopher Columbus, for instance, we love to teach how he discovered America, right? But we don't teach how he actually committed genocide and went through and all of that. We're starting to more have that conversation these days, but we still teach the very sanitized version of what America is. And by not teaching the full scope of it, we don't allow people to truly make their own decisions based off of the learning as to who these people really were. When you don't know both sides of somebody, you can't make up an opinion or figure out how you actually feel about somebody. Instead, you only feel that Christopher Columbus is a hero. So how do we continue to combat this?
Oof. Day by day.
Yes, truth.
I think, you know, I'm a strong advocate of people in districts and systems auditing their curriculum. I mean, I think the pandemic has provided, if one thing, it's provided a perfect opportunity to clear out our schoolhouses. And before coming back, like, look at your curriculum. There are things, just because a textbook company sells it doesn't mean it is true. Get into the archives, learn do some research, go to your local universities, and they have these various opinions and accounts of things that happen in history. By now, everyone knows what Christopher Columbus did. And if they don't, I don't understand how they don't know. So there should be nowhere that this should be being taught again. But people have to also understand that there are agencies out there that are sending out model policies to certain politicians to introduce into bills, to introduce bills into laws to say that it is a crime, to make it criminal to do this. Those things are happening now. It just happened last week in Rhode Island. So we have to be vigilant to make sure these things don't come to fruition in Connecticut, to say that it is going to be against the law to teach about diversity, to teach a true history, or at least both accounts of history. And like you said, let people make up their own mind, because to come back to what people want to say, we want to get back to normal. Normal wasn't working. And we can't go back to that. I, as a principal, oftentimes, would set a standard of we're not doing the Christopher Columbus, we're not doing the 5-finger turkeys. We're just not doing it in the building, because it's culturally insensitive to people who had to go through genocide, be ripped out of their communities, land stolen, and treaties broken. We're just not having that here in this school. But I had the courage to do it. Not all people who look like me have the same courage to do and speak out. Some people are just trying to make it and assimilate, and we have to respect that. So you want more Black and brown leaders to speak out and hold and move communities in certain ways and disrupt. You have to make it safe for them to do that. And not listen to the squeaky wheel, whether it be the union or the good old boys network in the community, what have you. You have to make it safe for people to go out and speak and say, you're doing students an injustice. You're not giving them an adequate, free, and appropriate public education. And this is criminal. And this is what we need to do. And we can find the answers together, but you have to come into the conversation with an open mind. If you're not coming into conversation with an open mind and realizing that some things are wrong and you have to learn things to do differently, then, you need to leave the profession and stop doing harm. Who would keep going to a bone doctor and they've had a cast on their leg forever? We just keep just putting a cast on a broken bone that's not healing, and it's not fair.
Right. Before either of the sisters say anything, there's a comment over here that says the Idaho legislative just cut all funding for state university social justice programs, diversity programs, critical race theory, student activities, clubs, and events on campus. This affects not only the students, but the untenured professors. Legislators around the country are trying to stop the teaching about racism and sexism. And we saw what I believe it was in Utah. They had the superintendent was cutting it out as well. And then after some backlash, they decided maybe that was the wrong idea. Yeah, you think?
What
And
people may not-
also,
and Elijah, you didn't have an opportunity to pull this up, but what people may not understand is underneath that is an organization called ALEC, ALEC. And they write these model policies for politicians and
Right.
they send them out, and then they're able to introduce. So if you pull Utah's and Rhode Island's, they will be very similar in the language if you look at it. That's what they do. So it's being done.
right. So, and then there's one more conversation about Black History Month. And it says, even Black History Month to me as a foreigner looks like a celebration of Black contributions to white history only, not actually teaching the full history of Black people in the Americas. And I would agree with that. And it's almost one of those month ideas of, well, how can white people celebrate Black History Month without having to necessarily do the work all the time? That's what it's kind of become, and what it looks like as the scope of continued learning. And that can't be anymore. Like, it has to be a teaching that is more fully throughout the entire year, because we can't have it be like, hey, yay, party, Black History Month, look at what we're doing.
I know.
And that's really what
Rosa and Martin are just tired. Rosa Martin
Right.
and Malcolm are tired. I was like, there has to be more than 3 Black people in the
I just want to say one thing. It's just on my heart, and it's kind of been on my heart this whole year. Just every year I've been in education. It's like, what is the role of school? Like, I just think, and I grapple with that every day, being in front of children, because I think, like, what we're talking about, that was never the point of school. Like, school was not supposed to center truth and reality. It's right. And so like, to me, especially as, you know, a Black woman in education, I'm like, school was never that for me. Like, and my most recent reflection of this was like the Black Panther movie that just came out. And I was reflecting on, like, how did I learn about the Black Panther Party? And I'm like, I definitely didn't learn about it in school. Like, oh, okay, my father taught me at a very young age. And I think even that is just an example that made me think, like, what is the purpose of school? Like, what is the role of school? Because in my specific seat as the Dean of College and Career Services at a college and career, you know, school, it's like the vision is we still equate freedom for Black and brown students to, like, earning a 4-year college degree. So if that's the role of school, then school can't then there's no space. People will have you think there's no space to talk about the real or reality, because we need students to pass AP classes, and we need students to, like, perform well on tests so that they can get into college. And so I just think I'm always unpacking that question. And I just wanted to, like, bring this to this space, because as we think about what we our freedom dream of what school should be, it's actually disrupting and abolishing what it currently is. And that is going to take time, which is why people create their own freedom school spaces outside of the 4 walls of the schools that we all, you know, are supporting. So I just wanted to share that reflection that I'm feeling.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. So there's a question coming in over here. It is much harder for people of color to achieve tenure as a teacher or professor, but schools keep saying they want diversity. What is the deal? And how do we help to push that further for teachers of color to be able to receive tenure? I mean, we saw what happened with even one of the most prominent in Cornell West not receiving tenure. So obviously that is a roadblock in there. And how can we help to combat that system?
I think for me, it's one word, like organize, right? I think, like, unions have organizing roots, right? Like, that's what unions were born out of, even though unions have you know, some anti-Black and like racist history as well. But like just really like the power of organizing is like the ability to build power with people for change. And so, and that takes courage, right? Like that takes risk. It takes organizing and strategy. And I see like we do so much back and forth in our organization about working like outside of the system and with the system and who can we trust as allies. And it's because, right, like so many educators are at risk, right? Like if I disrupt, what's at risk is actually my career and my livelihood, right? But how we flip that on its head is around it. It's about people power, right? Like there's not a force stronger than people power. And so like it starts with conversations like this, right? And then like you go as an educator, like you go and have this conversation with another educator, right? Like and that can catch, right? But it doesn't come without risk.
Right. You're absolutely right. It all is about that calculated risk and what are you willing to give up.
Yeah.
And to Atalia's point about what is the role right now with the current system, the role of education, unfortunately, is to teach Black and brown kids how to navigate the current system so that they can get into college, so that they can matriculate and they can get a degree. Unfortunately, that's what it is. But when I was younger, not only would my parents teach me Black history, but my church played a pivotal role in Black history and rearing me as part of a larger community. So where those systems have broken down and deteriorated in some places and spaces over time as people move from their countries where that may have been the case to a new country, you know, to try and build that sense of community around them and be accepted, it is very different for some students that are now sitting in front of us. So I guess, you know, society then looks for the school teacher to fill that void. Otherwise, they would never be exposed to it. That's why it's imperative that these things be integrated and be the curriculum. There's not a reason that any child in K-12 public education should. There's no reason you can teach literary devices without teaching Shakespeare. It is okay. I don't need to read all the Shakespeare. I'm going to tell you right now, I got a terminal degree, 2 master's degrees, and a bachelor's, and I'm trying to figure out when I'm going to use Shakespeare. I have yet to use it. Now, I'm not saying that his plays want all of that in a bag of chips, but you don't need to keep teaching this to me every year just because it's been tradition, it's been custom. Disrupt some of that. You know, get in some W.E.B. Du Bois, put in some Ida B. Wells, put in some people that students are like, who's that? The other Black people that we don't get to celebrate in the 28 days in February.
Ella Baker.
Anybody. I mean, you know, when I have to go and tell a music teacher in Stonington that my child should not be leading a solo in Dixie, and he didn't understand the problem. Well, now let's just talk about this, Mr. Man.
Right.
Now there's one of 5 Black kids in the school, and you got her talking about Dixie. This is not going to work out. And for him not to know the history of the song.
Right.
Correct. I mean, you know, but I had to take the time to do that. And you know, it's a lot. It's a lot. And so yes, right now we have to get our children out of the system to work within another system, which is very complicated, right? And survive it all. The policing system, the educational system, the healthcare disparity system, they got to work through all of that. And hopefully if they come out on the other side, they'll be able to make a living and be productive in this United States of America. All the while we're behind them trying to disrupt the system. So maybe the next generation doesn't have to go through this.
Correct.
So I know we're just about out of time, but I really did want to touch on, because I know the sisters both are into the arts. And so I wanted to take a moment to just talk about that real quick. You know I myself am into the arts as well, as Miss Camilla Ross will tell you. But you know, she uses it as a way of teaching history and through theater. And I'm not certain on, I believe you do some poetry and things of that nature. And I think art should and be used more often, because it's such an expressive way to deal with one's problems, or to give a voice or word to feelings that are difficult to express. But we know not every child is so easily involved. And how do we reach those children that are having the most difficulty expressing themselves? And what are some inequalities you have run into when doing this type of work?
Yeah, I think art is like, it's so vastly like undervalued. It's really incredible. I was in a conversation with someone the other day who's, you know, a published author, and basically saying like, you know, I don't get you know, I will always be underpaid as an artist. So when I just want to talk about like, what we actually like attach value to, right? And how like, yeah, that's a whole other thing. I'm not gonna go all the way into that right now, but
I will agree with that 100%. You know,
yeah,
I background myself, so I'm all on board with
Right.
that value.
yeah, you feel me? So I just think, like one, we just have to value art as the teaching and really at the root, like kind of disruptive nature that it has, right? And like appreciate that as much as of a learning tool as any like standard curriculum is.
Yep.
And I think like there's music, right? Like music is a teacher as much as anything else is, right? We could go for hours and hours, like just talking about all the lessons that there is in all the music that every artist has ever made. But yeah, I think it's like, it's about bravery, and it's about your own creativity as an educator, right? Like trusting that muscle as much as anything else. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I don't know if anybody's familiar with this book.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. He's one of the Central Park Five, helped write this book, and he uses art, his poetry, to talk about his time and how he survived for all those years in prison. And you know, when we talk about it being an outlet for being able to express oneself, you know, how can we find that outlet in our society? And sometimes there's not a way. And you know, STEM is called STEM, but they've opened it up to be called STEAM, because they're finally including the arts. And it is such an important thing for everybody. I mean, arts is not just music or poetry, it's any form of writing as well. And you know, James Baldwin is an artist with his words, you know,
yes,
specifically. And you know, we don't always put them under the same concept of arts. We just talk about them as wonderful speakers or whatever. But Frederick Douglass is an amazing speaker as well. But that's a theatrical, because at that time, that's what theater was, you know, a big part of theater, because you didn't sit at home and watch TV. You went out and you saw these speakers, and Frederick, that's how he lived, and that's how he was able to, you know, become the worldwide known, because of his wonderful speaking. And that can go to the same arts that we're all talking about right now, and using that as a healing mechanism for everybody. So I know we're pretty much just about out of time. Is there anything that you wonderful ladies would like to say before we end our discussion for the evening?
I just want to thank all of you. Thank you, Mr. Manning, Dr. Carrie McWilliams, the sisters Shepherd, Pamela, and Maya, I love you both.
Love you too.
I would love to continue this conversation. This was one of the most powerful discussions we have had in the series, I have to say, and I would love to continue it. And maybe we can talk about art at some point as well.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the participants, audience members who joined in. And hope you can be with us next month when we discuss equity in the corporate world in May.
Mm.
Thank you so, so much.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
This was wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
And everyone, thank you.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye-bye.